boots off and trod on the toes, and the other lads, who'd been arrested before me, realised what was going on, started protesting, to them to leave me alone, which they did leave me alone, and my wrist came up, in a big lump, and I complained that I couldn't move it. They took me to Berks Hospital, but it was found I had a fractured arm.
When I see him after appearing in court, he got a broken arm, his lip was busted, his hooter was up the creek, and he was in a right old state. Now, once he gets in that wagon, he should be safe from any intimidation whatsoever. This is what the law's supposed to represent, surely, of course.
This is what they're supposed to damn to represent. But what happens?
When a man becomes a member of the police force, surely he should be beyond brutality. He should be. He's a part of the law. He's enforcing the law, therefore you don't knock people apart.
I've always felt that the type of person who becomes a policeman is somebody, if you remember back at school, the type of person who'd like to be a bully but can't be because there's somebody bigger than him. But when they get a uniform on, there's something else. They represent something else. You can't hit that uniform.
Put it this way.
No, this is wrong, Vic. My brother's policeman.
I've never met anyone who ever... If they think that you are nothing, you're just an ordinary working bloke, like working class man, and you've got no pull with anybody whatsoever, they'll take all the liberties they like.
Well, no, make this point. I mean, they're police, but they're ordinary people in the same situation, same prejudice, the same stupidities. They're ordinary people. If you hammer a policeman, he's going to down and hammer you back.
Oh, don't it's when ordinary people. They're not ordinary people. They're upholding the state, and the state is everything to them. It's their whole part. This is what they're there for, to uphold the state. And when they get in there, mate, no matter who it is, if you oppose the state, they're going to annihilate you. And that's what they do, and that's what they've done to young Dave.
That pub conversation alleging police brutality was the original opening of the Cause for Concern programme entitled Equal Before the Law, which we planned to broadcast a fortnight ago. Now, if these allegations are true, it's a very serious problem. But when the victims of police unfairness are coloured, it becomes infinitely more serious. Our programme dealt with the highly controversial and difficult question: is there a measure of racial prejudice in the police, particularly the Metropolitan Police Force, sufficient to affect the carrying out of their duties? Now, that film, as you probably know, was postponed after protests from the Metropolitan Police on legal and other considerations. These legal difficulties, at least, have now been resolved. So tonight we're going to try to show you that film and then turn the whole question open to a studio discussion between representatives of the police, led by the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Force, Mr. Robert Mark, and members and spokesmen for the coloured communities. And it's only fair to tell you at this stage that when the film was originally shown to police representatives 2 weeks ago, they thought it biased against them. Now, the film started by examining a number of cases where coloured people had been arrested, charged, and subsequently cleared.
Two years ago, George Hislop, a teacher, and Desmond Allen, a barrister, were awarded £8,000 damages against the police for malicious prosecution. One evening in 1963, George Hislop had just bought some cigarettes, and along with Desmond Allen, he was strolling down the Finchley Road. They were suddenly stopped by two plainclothes officers, who, after a brief questioning, said that they wished to search them.
This is the telephone kiosk in which we were searched that night. After I'd emptied my belongings, and Mr. Allen had shown what he had as well, one officer standing at the door looked over Mr. Allen's shoulder and asked the other one, "Do you reckon these two?" And the other one said yes. And he said to me, "Very well, I'm placing both of you under arrest." When Mr. Allen asked what for, he said, for attempting to steal and drive away a motor car. The strange thing about it is that at that time, Mr. Allen wasn't able to drive, and I hadn't got a current driver's license.
They were taken off to Hampstead Police Station. George Hislop told Sue McConaughey what happened then.
We were asked to empty our pockets, and after we had done so, one of the officers went off to a room and came back, and he placed a bunch of keys among Mr. Allen's possessions. And as he did so, Mr. Allen said, "What are those?" And he said, "Those are the keys you were trying the cars with." Miss Allen protested and said, "Well, I know nothing of those keys." And he kept doing so throughout the evening. One of the officers said, "Well, if they don't want to cooperate, lock them up until they are prepared to do so."
In court, what threw most out on the police story?
Well, I think the entire case was revolved around credibility. And it was more a case of their word against ours. And our case was a much better case than theirs. And this is as far as I could see. They were obviously lying throughout.
Sir Dingle Foote defended them on acquittal. Sir Peter Rawlinson represented them 3 years later when they sued for damages.
We won because we were fortunate in having good defense lawyers. But a lot of people I know are not as fortunate as we are. And the contempt the police showed for us, I'm sure that these people suffer a lot. And I know it for a fact, because a lot of my friends have complained to me about the treatment they have received as well.
We also spoke to a barrister who is writing a book on the legal aspects of the Race Relations Bill.
I had a case quite recently where two CID plainclothesmen picked up a couple of young coloured boys in the Kensington area and put them on the charge of being suspected persons loitering with intent. And the two boys had been running from one bus stop to another on their way home from work. The police gave evidence about them dipping in women's handbags at bus queues and this kind of thing. And they swore black and blue that they'd first observed these boys at 5:20 p.m. and kept them under observation for 20 minutes. And we had the clocking out cards for the boys from their place of work, which was at least 10 minutes away, which said 5:24. And the case was dismissed, and it was quite clearly a concoction. That case was one of those cases, 1 in a million really, where you get such concrete evidence that you can get your chaps off. But I've done lots of other cases, for example, of people loitering, suspected persons, where we didn't have that kind of luck, and there's no saying whether those particular boys were innocent or not. And obviously the police are going to get away with it in 99 cases out of 100, whether or not it's true.
In 1963, a former colonial police officer, Henry Court, now a supervisor with the USAF, had a brush with the police when he was driving home his friend, Cephas Nichols.
As we stopped here outside his house, Nichols got out of the car and was going upstairs. When a police car stopped ahead of me, one of the police officers came out of the car and accused Nichols of being the driver of the car. It seemed silly to me because I was still sitting in the driving seat. Nichols said he wasn't driving the car, and one of the police officers said that you all must be poncing to run a car like this.
They took offence, an argument developed, and they found themselves at Harrow Road Station.
About half an hour after, they came, 4 officers came, and they took me to the sergeant. The sergeant said that the officers alleged that I have Indian hemp in my possession. They found me disposing of it behind a radiator. I told the sergeant, I know nothing about Indian hemp. You're trying to frame me. Some time after, 4 other police officers came and said they're taking me to be fingerprinted. I was there on the floor because I was struggling with a slip disc. The harassment that they gave me, I started to feel pain in my back. So on their way upstairs, they started cuffing me at the back of my neck and kneeing me in my back. My leg began to get weak, so they hold me on my armpit, and they dragged me up the 2 flights of stairs into the fingerprinting room. As I arrived at that room there, I collapsed on the floor because I couldn't stand anymore. For whilst lying on the floor, one of the police officers said, if he doesn't want to get up, I'm going to get him up. I'm going to shoot him. He went to the cupboard and brought out something and placed it between my legs because I was lying on my back. He lit it, and it went off with a bang. I couldn't move my legs. Hence, one of the other officers said, "You better get the doctor for this man." He took a look at me. He said, "I am malingering. I can be detained."
As I understand it, you elected to go for trial for this. Why?
Because I wanted justice, and I felt that I would have more justice in a high court than a magistrate court. My friends thought it was a waste of time, me going up top there. Being charged, I mean, to use the exact words, being charged by a white man. A white man is going to be giving evidence against you. A white man will be sitting there, I mean, hearing the evidence, and they're the people to judge you. It's a waste of time, they told me.
But for Henry Court, it wasn't a waste of time. He was acquitted, and later, when he sued the police for assault and malicious prosecution, he settled out of court for £1,500. His solicitor, who has successfully defended a number of coloured people, claims that racial prejudice is sometimes involved in such prosecutions.
Well, I think there's quite a fair element of prejudice in the police force as far as coloured people are concerned. Obviously, when a policeman joins the force, he doesn't put off his prejudice when he puts on his uniform. And certainly this is something that has to be combated.
The kind of offences which I think that the police tend to concoct the evidence run very much in the areas where the popular prejudices are. For instance, there's a popular prejudice against coloured people because they have loud and noisy parties. And I've done a lot of cases arising out of parties. It used to be, you know, the police would go along and get a warrant to go into a house. Drinks charges, drugs charges would come out of it. Another area is after dances, you know, West Indian dances. You get the police there and they're trying to pick up a few people for insulting behaviour or having offensive weapons. There was one case I was in where we had two witnesses who actually saw the police take a piece of wooden fencing off a fence nearby, which they then got up in court and said that this particular black person had been waving this vicious-looking stick around, and he was on a charge. Well, this particular case, the man was acquitted because the two witnesses had seen him. But what the police did, they saw one of those witnesses watching them pull this thing off, and they arrested him and put him on the charge of using insulting behaviour. He was also acquitted of that. So that parties is one area. Another area, obviously, is the popular prejudice that an awful lot of black people live on the NAB. So it's terribly easy for the police. They see particularly a young coloured person wandering around during the day looking at shops when they think he ought to be working. And so they nick him on being a suspected person.
Let's now examine what happened to 19-year-old Irving Corridon last May. They think a lot of him at the firm where he's been for 2 years now. One lunch break, he was returning to work.
As I reached to the top of Oxford Circus, there I saw these two men following this coloured man, you know, eyeing him like, you know, but I paid no attention.
At least he didn't until, as the other coloured man went into a shop, they turned their attention to him. They followed him at a distance down past the Academy Cinema. He then noticed them close in on him by their reflection in a shop window. They took him by the arm and identified themselves as police officers.
I said, well, what you was following me for? I haven't done anything. He said he's arresting me for loitering and intent to steal a woman's handbag.
And they took him to West End Central.
As we joined closer to the station, he said to me he had arrested one of us yesterday. The boy had pleaded guilty and everything was over and done with. When I got there, they were still nagging at me, you know, saying that I should plead guilty, you know, and they took my belongings, everything, you know, from me, and chucked me into the cell.
Next day at court, one of the detectives was there when Corridon filled in a legal aid form.
After filling it out, he took it from me, you know, and just squashed it up and said, you know, that my boss and my mother said to plead guilty and let everything done away with, you know.
Mr. Brown, did you on any occasion when you spoke to the police advise that Corridon should plead guilty?
Oh no, on the contrary. I suggested to the police that he should plead not guilty and ask for an adjournment.
Mr. Cooper, what was your reaction to this case as his employer?
I was rather shocked at what appears to me to be quite an injustice on the part of the police. And certainly I feel very troubled if this is an indication of what may be going on in other parts of the country.
Irving Corridon had an employer who cared enough to pay for his defense, and he was acquitted. Otherwise, as legal aid was rejected by the court, Corridon would have been undefended. And it's this feeling of vulnerability, whether real or imagined, that a Trinidadian barrister thinks could build up dangerous social tensions.
The policeman who frames a black man is doing so with a confidence that the system is going to give him a conviction, which reproduces a lack of confidence in the black man. So that you must see this against a background of two cross-sections of the community. One, the civil servant or the school teacher or so, who's going to react by exploiting the processes of law in the conventional sense. And then you have another cross-section of the community who one must call the most alienated, whose reaction is going to be through a different perspective, in that they either are going to turn to crime in that they're going to be arrested anyway, or seek their revenge against the society in another form. At this point in time, that form has not been expressed, and one hope it wouldn't be.
Why do so few people complain?
Who is going to take up a case when you have that whole weight of the system against you? And the West Indian, the black West Indian isn't doing this, and I don't think one should ask him to do this either.
But somebody who did was Gibbs Roberts, a civil servant. Last February, he was accused of indecent behavior while drunk.
When this happened to you, what was your reaction?
I was absolutely astounded at the police action. I've heard about this type of thing time and again, and I have friends whom it hasn't happened to. Unfortunately, one never thinks that it's going to happen to oneself. And, I mean, just having a quiet drink and wanting to go home and have a rest, waiting for a bus and finding yourself in the same position.
It all started one winter's evening near Archway Station.
Well, I was standing here waiting on the 41 bus to take me home. And at that time, I was a bit chest, you see, so I turned around like this, and I was pressing my chest when I felt the touch on my shoulder. Looking around, I saw the police officer. He asked me what was my name, and I asked him why he wanted this. Then asked me whether I was passing water on the ground. So I said, don't be so naive. If one is passing water on the ground, you would see it on the ground, won't you? Then another police officer came out, and he asked whether he was getting trouble with this one. So I asked him whether he wanted someone to arrest tonight. They arrested me, pushed me in the van as though I was a criminal, drove me to the Holloway police station, and I was charged.
The only point from which a man standing in the doorway could have been seen was from directly opposite him. In court, however, the police claimed that they had been parked 20 yards further down the road. But from that position, it was proved that Roberts would have been invisible.
The police said that you were drunk. Did they bring any proof of this?
There was absolutely no proof of my being drunk. No medical evidence whatsoever. It's just the police's word against mine.
After it was all over, how did you feel?
I now realized that I, as a black man of this country, is a victim of the police injustices to us. And I know this is a case for all of my brothers, that they are potential victims to the police.
But you won your case.
Yes, I won my case, but this is no longer relevant to me. The fact that I have won the case is simply because I happen to be Gibbs Roberts, a government civil servant. I have a good background. But what about my poor brothers? What about them? They are the ones who cannot afford a legal representative to pay 40 or 50 pounds to a council to go and fight for you.
At this stage of the original program, the halfway stage, we came back to the studio to ask some rhetorical questions. How exceptional are these cases, we asked? And more significantly, are these cases symptomatic of racial discrimination by police officers? On that occasion, the police were not appearing in the program, but tonight we have the benefit of the presence of the Deputy Commissioner himself, and I'd like to offer him now the opportunity of commenting on the first 4 cases that we depicted.
Well, thank you. Before I comment on the first 4 cases, I would like to tell you that I propose to show that there is good reason to doubt the truthfulness of one of the participants in the very damaging pub conversation, since he has deliberately omitted facts which would tend to discredit his story. I shall do this by calling before you in the second part of the program the police officer by whom he was arrested and who was assaulted by him so seriously that he later received substantial compensation for the injuries he received. The man I refer to in that pub conversation was also prosecuted for this serious assault on the officer and was convicted. Now, so far as the second part of the transmission is concerned, in the case of Mr. Allen and Mr. Hislop, the jury found in favour of the plaintiffs, and we certainly do not quarrel with that verdict. In the case of Mr. Court, as you remarked, we considered that the plaintiff had a claim which it was perfectly proper to meet, and the damages were not, of course, as you said, awarded by a court, but paid by us into court without the need for the case to go to trial.
May I just correct you, sir? I did not say they were paid by a court. I said that it was settled out of court.
As you said, that in fact it was paid without the need to go to court.
Yes, indeed.
I think you must have misunderstood me.
I'm sorry.
Whenever we're satisfied that our officers are in the wrong, we're prepared to pay proper compensation. In all those cases which ended in acquittal, we think it's not necessarily fair to assume any wrongful action by the police. Hundreds of people are acquitted every day of the week in our courts, but this doesn't mean that the prosecution was necessarily brought for an improper motive. It merely means that the prosecution have failed to discharge the burden of proof, and that the defendant was very properly given the benefit of any reasonable doubt that there was. Let me demonstrate this quite quickly by touching on one of the cases to which you've referred, that of Mr. Gibbs Roberts. Now, the film, I think, gives the impression that he was acquitted. In fact, he was convicted, and he appealed to quarter sessions, and in allowing the appeal, the learned chairman made the following remarks. This is a transcript of the remarks by the chairman. This appellant was returning home late at night and emerged from the tube station onto the footway. He then walked along and stopped by the doorway of the shop, and he gives the name of the shop, and he then proceeded to urinate into the doorway. The officer very fairly said that if you had not behaved rather stupidly and refrained from giving your name and address, he would not have arrested you. It is equally clear that you were capable of walking, although you showed signs of having taken drink, and that you were able to look after yourself. It turned out that somewhere in the neighbourhood there was in fact a public convenience that you could have used. Perhaps you were not to know this. The court knows that many is the time when people are caught extremely late at night and want to relieve themselves. That is the sort of thing that happens. If it happens that a policeman happens to be around, then one is liable to find himself arrested, or at any rate rebuked. In this case, we think there is a possibility he was not under the influence of drink, so that he could have been described as drunk and indecent. We are satisfied he was uncooperative. In the circumstances of this case, the appeal will be allowed and the conviction quashed. That is in fact what the chairman said, and I think you'll agree that this puts a rather different complexion on the incident than the film. And it illustrates also the point that I was trying to make about acquittals. I think that's all the comment I'd like to make at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Perhaps we'll come back to that later on in the program.
Yes,
now, in our original film, Equal Before the Law, Sue McConaughey now talked to an ex-police constable from the metropolitan area who left the force last year with a very good conduct record.
Well, I think in the police force you'll find a complex of prejudiced minorities. For example, you might find a certain number of police officers would be prejudiced against taxi drivers, bus drivers, or against Jewish people. But I think the coloured prejudice is virtually absolute. In other words, it extends probably 99%.
What efforts were made by senior officers to counteract it?
None at all that were apparent. Either they are unaware that it exists, or else they just choose to ignore it.
Amongst yourselves, when you talked about coloured people, what was the general attitude?
I suppose one of looking on inferior people.
What sort of pressures are there on a policeman if he wants to do well at the job?
Well, there is this sort of hard man cult which exists amongst the lower ranks. And this requires a young man to prove himself in many ways. And mainly it requires him to prove himself by the number of arrests that he makes.
What about this in relation to coloured people? Are they more vulnerable?
Well, the old tradition would be that the coloured man is not as fully aware of his rights as a white man would be. And on this assumption, I suppose he would be more vulnerable. But I think generally the prejudice would make him more, the prejudice which exists would make him more vulnerable.
How did you feel about it?
Well, it's very difficult to preserve any individual views that one might have had at the outset. It's, you get carried along with the tide. It's very difficult.
Did you ever feel like objecting?
Well, actually, one does feel like objecting. I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I felt like objecting on a few occasions, but it would have been out of the question. It would have been, I'd have been socially unacceptable within the police force.
Mr. Mark, would you care to comment on these opinions from an ex-serving police officer?
Yes, I would indeed. I wouldn't think of suggesting to you that the police force does not share proportionately the prejudices of the society from which its members are drawn and to which they belong. It's the responsibility of all of us to try to eradicate those prejudices. I think this is unlikely to be achieved by suggesting that 99% of a force of 20,000 are prejudiced, when I should think it quite impossible that the Speaker can know more than a handful of them. On the question of senior officers doing nothing about it, I don't, of course, know when this witness, if he may be called a witness, left the force. But perhaps in the second part of the programme, if time permits, you might permit me to read part of a most impressive leading article by Sir Joseph Simpson, distributed in the Metropolitan Police newspaper, The Job, to every single man in the force on this very subject. I think that's all I'd like to say about this particular witness.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Now, the second half of the original film then went on to examine some other aspects of the question. A lecturer in French at a local technical college claims that the police actively discriminate in favor of white people. In June of last year, the lecturer, Dennis Noel, was eating in a Pakistani cafe in the Commercial Road one night with some friends when another diner, a white man, offered to fight the waiter for the price of a meal. Noel intervened on behalf of the Pakistani and was assaulted for his pains. The man and his companion were caught and held by the others in the cafe.
We called the police by telephone. 2 men arrived, came in here, and didn't really ask any questions at all. They simply took the 2 men who were pinned down outside, and within a couple of minutes, the police had disappeared, and the 2 men were standing out there free as air. So immediately we called the police again. In the meantime, the big fellow comes back in here and says to me, "Hey, you're a wog lover then," and then went off. By the time that the police car had come with 2 uniformed policemen, he disappeared completely. The uniformed policemen weren't at all helpful about the incident. They told me, "You won't get any support at all. I advise you to drop it." I explained that I would get support, but couldn't make any more impression than that. They went off. Next day, the 3 of us went round to Lemon Street Police Station, where we made a statement, signed statements, bringing an official complaint against the police.
What's your feeling about this particular incident?
Well, how I see things is this. Some people committed crime here. They were caught, police came, rescued them, and vanished with the criminals.
Does this sort of thing happen often?
Yes, there have been any number of cases in the locality here. We've investigated some of them with the Pakistani Workers' School, and some of the cases have involved serious bodily injury, and the police, it seems, just have not made the proper inquiries.
The police deny these allegations. They claim they're doing a lot for race relations.
I can't quite adopt that police attitude. I can't say that. But in the survey, which was carried out in the ghetto areas, one finds that wherever the question was asked that committed black people to some positive opinion about the police, it was always that the police were vicious, that their children would never be allowed to join the police force, neither would they. So there is this basic antagonism, which it does exist and which has been created by the behavior of the police.
But what about the special police liaison officers?
That is a completely hopeless institution in that there is no respect from the police for the black community. So it's only going to come one way. They're going to come to say that, all right, we beat you up and this is why we beat you up. And there is no comeback from the community because there's this lack of respect.
How much is the police attitude a reflection of that of the general public?
No, I would always argue that the whole society is a racist society, and it's almost totally impossible to ask a policeman to be non-racist in a racist society. There's this basic contradiction. But because of the immediate inconveniences of police framing of black people, one must demand this.
Do you think the administration of the law affects the way the police operate?
The magistrates rubber stamp the police evidence. I mean, I had a case quite recently where I had 2 policemen giving evidence, and I had some quite respectable middle-class white witnesses giving evidence quite contradictory to the police evidence. And at the end of the case, the magistrate simply convicted, said, I accept the police evidence. And you get this rubber stamping throughout, and of course some of the worst offenders at rubber stamping are stipendiary magistrates.
Is it ever better with a coloured man than to go for a trial before a jury?
Personally, I would always prefer to have a case heard before a judge and jury than before a bench of lay magistrates. And on the whole, I would say that this is far preferable for the defendant, although not always the case.
Why?
There is the case that I had of quite a prominent coloured man who was accused of rather a nasty offence, went for trial before a jury, and during the course of the case, which rested solely on the evidence of one police officer, that police officer admitted that he had lied in his report to his superior officer, that he had lied in his evidence in the court itself. The judge, of course, stopped the case and invited the jury to return a verdict of not guilty. 2 members of the jury refused. The judge repeated his invitation, and again the invitation was declined, at which point the judge directed the jury to bring in a verdict of not guilty. And these 2 men, very grudgingly indeed, said, well, I suppose if we've got to, then we will do as we're instructed. And a verdict of not guilty was brought in. And as the interesting point was that as the jurymen were getting up and leaving the jury box, these 2 men were said and were heard to say, these black so-and-sos won't get away with it if I can help it.
What's the answer to all this?
Well, one of the answers is, I think, that we've got to start being honest about this. I think that, for instance, most black people know what policemen do to black people, but other sections of the community don't. Most working class people have some idea of the police. I mean, there used to be an old rule, if you saw a policeman, you cross over to the other side of the road and get out of the way. And I think that even more important is that most members of the bar who practice in the criminal courts know what goes on, but they keep silent. And I think that one has to sort of blow the lid on this, because I think that there is always a danger here that you put the interests of maintaining law and order before the interests of justice.
I know what is being done now is not going to solve anything. And one must be very direct here and see that the police must either stop it or the black communities would have to stop them from doing it. It's simply this. And in the United States, one sees that, you know, this is exactly how it turned out to be. So they have the lesson to learn from the United States.
Equal before the law or not. That film raised several large and contentious issues. Now, in some quarters, the subject is virtually taboo on the ground that any questioning of the rectitude or fairness of the police only serves to undermine the social structure of the country as a whole. And for that reason, we've invited into the studio all the main protagonists who took part in that film. The 4 cases of colored defendants, the lecturer in the Pakistani cafe incident, and the ex-policeman who spoke about police prejudice. Now, we invited them here in case they were required to elaborate or vindicate what they said in the film, but I do want to make it clear that what we want to discuss tonight is the larger issues underlying it. So we also have the barrister, who is a prominent member of CARD on the far left, the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination. We have the solicitor involved, and the Trinidadian barrister. And in addition, on the left, Mr. Jeff Crawford, Secretary of the West Indian Standing Conference, and on the right, Mr. Tony Smythe, Secretary of the National Council for Civil Liberties. And facing them to argue this vital point and put their point of view, the 3 policemen, the Deputy Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, whom we met already, in the middle, Inspector Reg Gale, Chairman of the Police Federation, and Chief Superintendent Ray Merricks, who's in charge of the branch at Scotland Yard, which deals with race relations. Now, at this point, Mr. Mark wants to introduce the evidence in rebuttal of our opening sequence. I must point out at this point that we only knew that this evidence was coming at 9:30 this evening, and the introduction of this caused some anger amongst the other guests in our studio. Now, may I now invite you, Mr. Mark, to produce your evidence?
Before that is done, we on this side have known absolutely nothing about this new witness. This new witness is coming to talk about a man who is not here to defend himself. Be he white, be he black. This is absolutely improper as far as I'm concerned. I'm not willing to take part in this program if a man is going to be talked about and he's not here to defend himself. And I'm going to leave.
May I ask you to stay on the ground that our interest, all of us here, is to raise and to illuminate the questions, the problems that you have articulated on the film, and that it's only fair that we should listen, even though you do so under protest, to the evidence that the opposing side wishes to lead.
My guidance here is a moral guidance. It is not a guidance of convenience, it's not a guidance of opportunism, it's a moral guidance. And I cannot simply sit here and see a man talked about without him being here to defend himself. And such...
I would like to take the larger view.
Too, if I may, because there are very strong legal objections as far as this is concerned. If accusations are going to be made by a witness against a man, he should be present while these accusations are made. That is a fundamental rule of any trial. Now, the only person who is not in this studio, who is shown on that film, are the people who took part in the pub discussion. They are the only people who are not here. The police spring this at the very last minute. We were walking up to the studio when we on this side of the table were told about this, although they've had 2 weeks in which to tell the BBC that they were going to do this, in which the BBC could have brought here, as they brought all the other people sitting behind me here, to the studio. They could have brought all the people concerned in that pub discussion to the studio. Now they intend to blacken the name of someone who is not here to defend himself. That is highly unfair, and I would appeal to you, Mr. Chairman.
May I put it now to Mr. Mark, having heard these objections, yes, and in the light of the fact that you did state very clearly what the nature of the evidence you were going to introduce was, yes, whether you'd be prepared not to introduce the actual witness so that the larger issues may be discussed.
First of all, let me hasten to explain to these gentlemen that the late forewarning of this is quite unintentional. We were not supplied by the BBC with the names or the particulars of the young men who took part in the opening conversation in the public house. A conversation, I'm sure you'll agree, that had it been made about you, you would have found highly offensive. And to meet your point, was not made in our presence.
Yes.
Now wait a minute.
Consulted at every stage.
May I please continue? The purpose of my wishing to lead this particular evidence is that I want to show that from our point of view, the police, this film demonstrates a technique not unlike that employed by the late and unlamented Dr. Goebbels to discredit the Jewish people as a whole.
Let's get over
Can I say something?
Let's get over here.
Look, on this one, can I come back on this?
May I hear Mr. Marks for a moment?
Continue?
So he can withdraw that remark or we go out straight away.
Well, it was addressed at the BBC, and the BBC is not taking offence. May he continue?
No, look,
The
there is
film,
one issue on
we
this.
wish to show that the film is a skillful mixture of truth, half-truth, and of opinion, put together in such a way as to appeal to ignorance and prejudice, and by this we mean that it's presented out of context. Unfortunately, only a small minority of viewers could be expected to have the knowledge to reject its general import. As to the calling of the witness to give evidence, if you prefer it administratively, or I'm quite prepared to tell you the story that the witness would have told you, and then you can call to cross-examine him if you like. But I insist, in view of this quite scandalous statement about the police with which you opened the film, that I be allowed to tell my version of one of the people who took part in it.
Can I come back on this, Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Because as far as I understand from what he said, the allegation in the pub scene is that someone had his arm broken in the police van. And Mr. Marks has said that that person was convicted of an offence against the police. But what has never been an issue in the courts is that the issue of the policeman breaking his arm. And if that issue is going to be brought into the public arena for the first time tonight, it would be highly improper if that took place without the man concerned being here.
Well,
and if you, and you are the chairman here, if you allow this witness to do this, this is not the terms on which we agreed to take part in this program. And if you insist that this witness comes in here and gives evidence, or if you allow Mr. Marks to give hearsay evidence, without that man being here to answer these allegations, it is highly unfair on the part of the police, and it is highly unfair for the BBC to allow it to happen. And I would ask that you make a ruling on this, and if you make a ruling that this witness is allowed to come and give evidence without there being anyone to answer the allegations he makes, then we, for our part on this side of the table, would feel obliged to withdraw. We discussed it in the 2 minutes before we came up, and that is the way in which we felt, that it is highly unfair to discuss issues which have never been discussed in any court before without having the person who is being accused here to answer the allegations.
I find myself in a highly difficult position because whatever ruling I make, we're going to be left without a program. If the witness goes on, you will walk out. If he doesn't go on, the police will not take part. May I appeal to the police to start with, on the ground that you have stated the evidence that you were going to bring, that in the interests of what I think is an extremely important subject, you waive your demand that you do produce the witness or give his hearsay evidence at this stage, in order that we can go on and discuss larger issues raised in this, in the hope that it may in fact help the situation.
No, these issues can be discussed elsewhere. The fact is that these discussions would take place under the influence of a film about which we have very serious complaint. We are in a position to prove, and I don't accept this gentleman's argument. We have taken legal advice as to this matter, and we believe it to be perfectly proper to in every way to call this witness, or if you wish for me to tell the story that this witness would tell. You may take your choice. How?
May I hear more submissions from over here? Mr. Crawford.
I rather belatedly accepted an invitation to appear on what is indeed the second transmission. The first one was killed 2 weeks ago.
Postponed.
Was postponed 2 weeks ago. And I accepted the invitation because it was going to be a discussion on the relationship between the Metropolitan Police on the one hand and my black brothers and sisters on the other hand. I don't want to go into the pros and cons of the opening scene. I think it is somewhat irrelevant to the body of this discussion, and I can't see any good reason why the police cannot agree to withdraw from their insistence that this be the essence of the program.
So far, we've only heard from one gentleman on the police side. Chief Superintendent Merricks, what is your view?
I would like to say that this program has only been, on the question of this time position, that this program has only been put back on the air within the last 48 hours or so. All we had to identify this particular incident was the Bart's Hospital. The question in the script mentions Bart's Hospital. I myself was responsible for identifying this incident only today.
Yes, I'm not in any way suggesting that what you're doing is unfair to the BBC. It may well be that
Mr. Magnus,
the fault is ours, not yours. All I'm doing is appealing to both sides to continue the programme.
In the general interest, may I interrupt?
Well, can we hear from Inspector Gale, who has not spoken yet?
Can I come in with a personal opinion, please?
Yes, Inspector Gale.
It's at the moment a shattering waste of time, what is going on. I'm surprised, if I may comment, first of all, I'm surprised at what I'm thinking in my mind as Barrister One, who speaks with what I think is an Irish accent sitting on the end,
Quite untrue.
objecting to hearsay after some of the hearsay that we've had to sit and listen to in that film. But nevertheless, I think that the major problems, the problems that these films raise, are things we should be discussing now, not the appearance of a witness or not. I think we've made our point now, and I personally hope that Mr. Mark and Mr. Mayrick could agree with me that we forget about the witness and get on with the programme.
Well, Mr. Magnusson,
Are you prepared
I can't
to do that?
promise to forget about him, but I'm inclined to agree that on the understanding that you, or that the other contributors to this programme object and decline to allow us to produce a witness who can in fact prove that the introduction to this programme is biased and unfair, I will agree to that we dispense with the witness and carry on with the programme.
Thank you, Inspector Mark. Your protest is noted. Can I now go into what we plan to be the general discussion immediately after seeing the film and ask Chief Superintendent Merricks, as the officer in charge of race relations, whether you accept that there is any racial discrimination amongst members of the Metropolitan Police Force? Any?
I think it's fair to say that, as Mr. Mark has already indicated, that we are a cross-section of society, and therefore, inevitably, there will be prejudice amongst our members. But I think the important thing is that whether we allow this prejudice to influence us in the way we carry out our duties. On this, I would give you a reply as follows. I'm quite sure when I say this, I'm speaking for every member of the Metropolitan Police, 20,000 men and women. But I would say that as far as the coloured man is concerned, if he complies with the law, then he's going to be no more vulnerable than is any other member of the community. I would go further than this. I would say that we as a nation, not merely ourselves as a police force, but we as a nation, in view of our great tradition of fair play, and despite any prejudice, we would not tolerate any other position. The difficulty is, I think, that the coloured man sees himself as vulnerable. And this is the problem we've got to face as a police force. He sees himself as vulnerable, and this is he sees himself as being vulnerable because every act of law enforcement that he is involved in, he puts down as racial discrimination or discrimination on the grounds of colour. Additionally, he believes unhappily, he believes every tittle of rumour, anti-police rumour, that there is going. And
may I ask Mr. Smythe of the National Council of Liberties, Civil Liberties, to come in now? Do you accept that there is too much jumping of conclusions amongst the immigrant communities, the coloured communities, from, say, one case, to which they make blanket allegations?
Yes, I think there are two problems here. One is the actual cases where discrimination can be proved, and on the other hand is the feeling amongst immigrants, which is extremely strong, that discrimination occurs. And it's with this sociological problem that I really think we have to grapple and come up with some constructive solutions during this programme.
What's left of this programme, yes. Can I bring in Inspector Gale here? So far we've talked about the Metropolitan Police, but it's clearly something which you must be aware of throughout the country. You represent the police nationwide as the police union. You are aware of the suspicion, at least, that there is racial discrimination.
I won't say that I'm aware that there's a suspicion. I'm perfectly aware that policemen are human beings. As has already been said twice, we're a cross-section of the public. Now, each and every one of us, as everybody over there and as you, has prejudice about something or other. I have my prejudices. And when I started being a copper, I had to learn to control them and not to let them affect my carrying out of my duty. Now, if we accept that because of this, there are some people who are probably or possibly colour prejudiced in the police, all well and good. There was one general assumption, though, that was made in that programme, which I didn't like. It's by our ex-policeman, Fenn, that 99% of the policemen are prejudiced. Well, he's only met a very small section of them. I represent something like 85,000 policemen. I've only met very few of them, and I've spoken to many of them intimately all over the country. And I haven't met any open racial prejudice from any of them. But if there is an appearance, and it's obvious that this program's taking place here tonight, that there is an appearance that there may be racial prejudice, well then I think it's a pretty poor do on all of our behalfs that the first time that we get down to discussing it seriously is under these circumstances.
Chairman, really, can I make a point here? You know, a large number of complaints about these sort of allegations go forward, and invariably they end up in the same way. The chief constable concerned, the Metropolitan Commissioner, finds no fault with the police officer concerned. And I firmly believe that if there could be a more serious way of dealing with complaints, perhaps we would have this out in a proper way. But at the moment, complaints against the police are investigated by the police. The results are given to the complainant by the police. No explanation is offered. What we urgently need, I believe, is an independent system of inquiry into police complaints. And I quite agree that the television studio is not the place, ideally, to discuss this issue, but we have been unable to raise it in any other way because the police are supported in the courts, in Parliament, in the newspapers. It is impossible to make a breakthrough in any way at all and get this subject seriously discussed.
Could I ask Mr. Mark to take up this point, which I think many people recognise as extremely important, as to whether the complaint procedure is seen to be satisfactory?
I'd be glad to. There's a great deal of misunderstanding about this, and I think Mr. Smythe has a point that the procedure is not generally understood. I don't think very many people in this country understand what happens when, or understands what action is open to a person who feels aggrieved by a policeman. First of all, if he alleges crime, the papers must be sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions. He can, of course, sue a police officer in the civil courts. If he makes a complaint which falls short of either of those two things, the complaint must be recorded. It can be investigated by that force or another force, and if there is a disciplinary inquiry, the complainant may attend the hearing. Elected representatives of police authorities have a duty to satisfy themselves as to the number and the manner of complaints in their areas and the way in which they're investigated. Every single complaint made against a police force must be reported to the Inspector of Constabulary before the annual inspection. The Home Secretary has overriding authority since 1964 to look into any matter of complaint against the police and to direct a report or an inquiry as he thinks fit. But in the Metropolitan Police Force, Parliament fills the role of the elected representative in the provinces. Now, this is rather a different position, I think, from that which Mr. Smythe has given you to understand.
Well, he hasn't given us to understand anything. Surely, in the present situation, isn't much of the concern due to the fact that the police are acting as judge and jury in their own cause, and that it might help matters if it were seen that the complaints were not being dealt with internally.
Could I add a point here that if the police are seen to be so bland and complacent about this situation, as we have seen on the other side of the studio today, as we have seen in the consistent efforts of the police to stop this programme, very little confidence can be had in their ability to deal with these complaints. I have no doubt, I know they go into them in great detail, but if they start with the assumption that a member of the police force can do no wrong, then we don't get anywhere at all.
Well, of course, they simply don't start with that assumption. I can give you that assurance straight away.
Let me
from Trinidad, our
we are talking about complaints, and I think that we are running the danger here of talking over the heads of ordinary black people. Now, black people in this society owe their existence and survival to the fact that they belong to a tradition of fierce and even violent resistance to all forms of brutality. This has never been expressed in history, and now the statistics show through liberal democratic institutions like the Race Relations Board or the Police Complaints Bureau. And to ask them to do that now, you know, it's a complete disrespect for the way of life, historical and present day, of black people.
I would like to say, Mr. Chairman...
Mr. Crawford.
It was pleasant to hear Chief Superintendent Merricks admit that there is a cross-section of prejudice within the police force. I would say that on average the prejudice runs deeper because firstly there is the inherent prejudice among the police force by the law of averages. There is also the police system which allows this prejudice to grow and to go unchecked. I also resent his sweeping allegation that the black community listened to every tittle of rumor. I thought he was just as ridiculous by making this allegation as to say that we do the same in the reverse, and that if we comply with the law, then there will be no problems. I think that on average, we are perhaps among the most law-abiding section of the community. In fact, in spite of all the persecution that we are subjected to, statistics, which include a lot of police framing, show that on an average, we are no bigger criminals than the rest of the community. Inspector Gill, chairman of the Federation, said that he represents 85,000 members, and he's travelled around the country, and he hasn't seen any signs of open prejudice. Well, you know, the British are known not to show their prejudices openly. You know, it's kept on our carpet. It's done in a subtle and discreet way. And I hope that Inspector Gill is aware of this. If he isn't aware of this, well, it's about time he becomes aware of this. Mr. Marks spoke about the complaints procedure. Well, I think this is absolutely ridiculous. You know, justice must not only be done, justice must be seen to be done. Here it is, you have a system which allows a man to investigate complaints made against his own brother. Now, any man who has been a member of an institution knows that the very last thing you ever do is to give against your brother. You only give against your brother when you can't conceal for him any longer. And the only way that some semblance of confidence can be sort of re-established is firstly for the complaints procedure to be revised so that outsiders, not only people elected by the police authority...
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. I think you made enough of a speech. Can we just have a rebuttal there from Chief Superintendent Merricks?
Of believing rumour. It is unhappily true that the coloured man is ready to believe. In fact, he even wants to believe all these dreadful rumours about the police force. I would illustrate this by a conversation I had with Jeff Crawford only the other day, when this programme wasn't put on before. He even said that we deliberately arrested Obi Egbunas to stop this programme going on the air. And this is something that he still continues to believe, that we're cunning enough to do this.
You were cunning enough to bring another witness and wreck this entire discussion during this programme.
Gentlemen, I think this has been dealt with. I'd like to put one point to Inspector Gale.
Mr. Crawford, I made it quite clear that I said I know we have prejudices. I have some. It's our job not to allow them to interfere with our duties.
This is the very point. Just one second, if I may. We're coming to you in a moment. I just want to put one point to you, Inspector Gale. When you say that you admit that obviously policemen are human, why does the Police Federation not accept, therefore, the value of putting in a saving discrimination clause into the policeman code of conduct in order that it can be seen that the police will not tolerate any prejudice within them?
It's unnecessary. It's already there.
Well, some people feel it is necessary. Therefore, isn't it a good idea?
Well, I can debate this somewhere else with them and explain why it's completely unnecessary. And coming back to the complaints procedure, you know, we have our complaints about it as well. We feel that perhaps we're not exactly equal under the law either, under this complaints procedure. We can't even have an argument over the garden fence with our neighbour without fear of it being invoked against us. And
right,
this is the
various
sort of
people over here.
ridiculous...
Can the barrister, our barrister at the far end, please?
On the complaints procedure, Mr. Marks outlined the complaints procedure. Now, this is a completely formal procedure And in practice, I don't think it simply just doesn't work. Because, first of all, as has been pointed out, the complaints are made to the police themselves. And they're the people who deal with it. And secondly, in most cases, or in a lot of cases, where someone has been framed, he will already have been convicted by the court, so the chances of the complaint succeeding are practically negligible. The other thing, of course, is that as far as you start off, you're arrested or you're framed up. And on most of the offences on which people are framed up by the police, it's practically impossible, and I know this from experience, to defend people in those circumstances because it's police evidence against your client's evidence. And the same policeman will be appearing in that court week in, week out. They'll be known to the magistrates, and it's extremely difficult for the magistrates to say, I think the police are lying. And that's why, in fact, most magistrates tend to rubber stamp. So if the police decide to frame you up on any number of cases, how do you defend a drugs planting case? Any of these cases, insulting words, threatening behavior, assaults on the police, these are cases where it is police evidence against your evidence, and the chances of you getting anywhere before the court are very, very small, and you get convicted. Okay, you're not satisfied, you appeal it. Well, the appeal will not succeed unless there's been some blatant abuse by the magistrates, so you don't succeed in your appeal. So you take a complaint to the police. Now the police, it's a policeman who sits in judgment. The court has already judged. Now, it's not surprising, as was already pointed out, that very few black people, or white people for that matter, take complaints. I suspect that the amount of police malpractices is very much greater than is being suggested on the other side of the table.
Thank
That
you.
is the
We've had
experience.
these 2 points of view about the police complaints. Now, the gentleman in the back who wants to come in, Mr. Dennis Knoll, our lecturer, who's involved in the Pakistani cafe incident. Nobody from the back has spoken yet.
Can we just get away a moment from the legalities of these questions and get back to what Mr. Merricks was bringing up about the vulnerability of the black man? Now, he suggested that this was something in the black man's mind and not, in fact, the case. It is the case, and it's directly helped by the police, too. In certain cases that I've investigated personally of assaults on Pakistanis in the Stepney area, it has been quite clear that the police have not made the proper inquiries at all, and therefore, as a result of this, the black man becomes a special target for attack, because any English person who has a mind to do these things, and there is a small section that does, then knows that if he attacks a black man, he's likely to get away with it much more easily than a white man. And to go on from this, in fact, something that was cut out from the original filming of this program, a remark that I made, that was that the police, in one particular case, had fabricated evidence and in fact had told a pack of lies in a particular case.
Mr. Knoll, I must say that is a kind of unsubstantiated statement which you've
I'm
objected
sorry,
to
I'm
from the
prepared
police,
to
and I must ask you to
substantiate it
withdraw it.
anywhere at all. They made this, told a pack of lies in a particular case of an assault on a Pakistani, and
I'm sorry, you cannot bring this up if there is not evidence to support it.
an
We have
official
not
report
allowed evidence
by
from
the
police
police
side.
to the
I'm sorry,
Home
Mr. Knoll, I'm
Office
going to
at that
rule you out of order. Can we hear from the solicitor here?
Mr. Magnusson, could I lower the temperature by answering Mr. Knoll on this point? It may, in fact, satisfy both you and him, and is, I think,
you wish.
non-controversial. It is, I think, the incident that we will call of the Pakistani cafe.
No.
No,
Oh, well,
this
then
is a separate incident, and I don't think it's fair that that
All
should
right.
be discussed
As
and
you
the other
wish.
one was not.
Can we hear from you in the temperature has lowered in the studio tonight? Isn't it quite clear that there is a problem of justice here? It's basically a question of justice and injustice. Here you have, rightly or wrongly, immigrant colored communities who feel a sense of injustice. If this is not investigated and ventilated, it can erupt in a very dangerous manner. It therefore seems that the police, who have a very hard task, who really are in the front line of society, should be open to discuss, to explain, to understand the background of these colored communities as much as possible, to see how they visualize the position, and to understand their problems. We've got a marvelous system of justice in this country.
But is this not being met by the liaison officer system that the police
No,
have
not
set
at
up?
all. It hasn't satisfied, it hasn't explained, it hasn't gone any way to deal with the sense of injustice.
May I just interpolate a comment? You say we have a marvellous system of justice in this country. I would like to point out that in this room tonight you have attacked stipendiary magistrates, lay magistrates, the bar, the police. What else is there that that's omitted from the system? And juries.
I hadn't finished my sentence, actually.
Since we are talking about justice, I think it's only fair that Mr. Russell Gibbs, who was attacked by the Deputy Commissioner, should have a chance to rebut what the Deputy Commissioner had to say, if you wish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Magnusson. The Deputy Commissioner spoke about half-truths, and he elaborated quite a lot on my case. I'd like to draw to the attention of the gentleman on that side that the chairman referred to me, I beg your pardon, the chairman, when I was referred to by the constable who charged me as a gentleman, he upbraided him for calling me a gentleman. So there are quite a lot of things that ought not to be mentioned at all by Mr. Marks as regards my being discharged or my conviction being
You probably have cause to upbraid me for calling you Roberts Gibbs instead of Gibbs Roberts. I apologize for that, Mr. Roberts.
I want to draw to the attention of Mr. Marks and the other gentleman on that side of the House that I have been in contact with many, many colored people who have complained about this type of aggression that we are discussing here tonight. That they come into the police station after being arrested and they are not cautioned that they are not bound to say anything, because if anything is said in evidence, beg your pardon, if a statement is given, this could be used against them in court. And I think this makes a mockery of British justice, because if you are going to make a statement which will eventually secure a conviction against you, then virtually you are being tried in the police station. I think that we ought to find a system whereby no statement is made to the police which would make you vulnerable before the court.
I think it's only fair now that our ex-police constable has a say too, if he wishes.
Yes, it seems that we're generally agreed that prejudice does exist. It seems that the only difference is to the extent of the prejudice. I was challenged as a witness because of my limited experience, so-called, but it's my contention that my experience is more relevant to the situation as it exists today, because of the fact that I was in the police force in the last 5 years when this problem has been at the fore of public debate. I don't doubt the integrity of the gentlemen on the other side of the room. I don't doubt that they're sincere in what they're thinking, but I maintain that the coloured man is not afraid of the Chief Superintendent from Scotland Yard. He is afraid of the policeman who's walking down Brixton High Street at this very minute. And I also maintain that these people on the other side are totally out of touch with what is actually going on in the lower ranks of the police force.
Well, thank you. Can I ask you, in the last few minutes that we've got left, to turn your minds to what constructive suggestions one can think of for reducing the tension which is clearly there, the suspicion that's clearly there. Could I ask for a comment from Superintendent Merricks? What would you like to see?
Yes, willingly, sir. I'm sorry to see the attacks being made on our liaison system, because this is a system that we adopted deliberately so that we can go outside the law enforcement sphere where there is so much trouble, to try and develop a dialogue, a two-way dialogue, which will be more or less in a social atmosphere. This is the object of this is to achieve a better understanding, and I seriously think that given time this will work. It is achieving a better understanding. I had Sam Morris, who was the PRO of the National Committee, rang me up today, and he confirmed this. Through this liaison system, an attack has been made on the way we deal with coloured parties. But in the last 10 months, I don't think this is generally known. We have been trying to deal with coloured parties, which are a grave source of complaint, both from the black sector and the white. Try to deal with these, not by prosecution, but by social action. Unfortunately, not through any fault of trying on our side, this doesn't appear to be working. But generally speaking, we are achieving a better understanding by these means.
Any suggestions from this side? Mr. Crawford?
Not for one moment the integrity of Chief Superintendent Merricks, but I would say that Chief Superintendent Merricks is not the typical police chief. and he's nowhere near the typical policeman. I think he's something approaching an odd man out.
Have you any suggestions from your own side of the fence, Mr. Crawford?
Yes, I think the basic defect is the training methods. The police training methods are archaic, they're outdated, they need to be revised. Outsiders, elected by the masses, must sit on all panels and tribunals dealing with complaints made by the public against the police. And also the magistrates' court need to look at, because I think this is a very, very big and substantial contributing factor to the injustices which black people suffer at the hands of the police.
Your neighbor beside you.
A policeman is only racist in that he's part of a racist society. And you cannot ask the policeman to change his racist clothing if you don't change the society. And that is the only solution. The black community says stop it and stop it now. That's all we have to say.
This is a problem for the whole of society. Mr. Smythe.
Chairman, I think one of the problems is isolating this and making it purely a police problem when, to our shame, we must admit this is a problem for the whole of our society. And if the police have prejudices, and I believe that many of them have, they are reinforced by many other institutions and many individuals. So we have to tackle this in a much broader sense than merely at the level of the police force itself. But I think one thing would help, and that is to bring the police force more into contact with the public. Somehow, you know, they're locked away from us. These discussions don't happen enough, either publicly or privately. And I think there must be much more opportunity for members of the public and members of the coloured community to meet the police force at every level and not merely at senior level at all, because this is not where the problem lies.
Dr. Gale? Can we just hear from Mr. Gale first?
I'm very interested in what's just been said. I think I must make the point here that whether we are or whether we're not, we would be crazy as a service to go along with our heads in the air, taking a course of action that would lead us to the results that they're having in Miami at the moment and have had in other parts of America. So no policeman is going to suggest that that is what we're doing accidentally or deliberately. If there is a problem here, I think it can be helped, first of all, by perhaps not making public statements which are open to doubt, and very public statements in front of a television camera. And secondly, if Mr. Smythe is interested, my national committee at the moment are considering a seminar of some form or another in the near future to have a look at this subject and to see what we can do to help. And he's already had lunch with my secretary anyway. If Mr. Crawford likes to come along any time, we'll talk to anybody at any time, anywhere. We'll even buy them lunch if they like.
It's a very fair offer. You were going to... Oh, yes, you haven't come in yet. At the back, Mr. Court.
May I ask one of those gentlemen, the speaker just now that just had his say, he did mention Miami and Florida. Now, can he, reasonably say how far away from Miami and Florida in terms of relationship between the police and the black man in this country? Now, the police, as I see it, and as a large, very large community of my section sees it, is that the police doesn't look at the black man as a second-class citizen any longer. He looks at him as an inferior people.
This is not a very constructive suggestion,
yes,
if I may say so, Mr. Court.
Of course, I beg to differ with you there just now, because the ex-police officer here, if I can follow up from what he said, that is that many of his colleagues that he was with at the station with, they seem to say, look at the black man as an inferior, not as a second class. Well, he was with these people in their police stations. And as they look at you as an inferior individual, you're being treated as an inferior individual. And except drastic changes are being made, and some sort of form of it is being made now, Well then, we know far from becoming a Florida or a Miami for that matter.
I was about to say your name, yes, our white barrister.
The problem here is not a problem of understanding or misunderstanding. It's not a problem of leaders, so-called, of one community or another, having lunch with leaders of the police force and senior officers. I'm sure that the senior members of the police force are aware of the problem, are aware of what's going on. The problem is how to stop the man on the beat framing people, black or white, harassing people, black or white, and that primarily is a problem for the police. Primarily. I would only like to make one suggestion, and that is that in those cases, and they will be very rare, where it is proved that a man on the beat has framed someone, has beaten someone up when he shouldn't have, or has harassed someone when he shouldn't have, that not only is that man dismissed from the police force, but that his commanding officer loses his rank completely, because in that case the commanding officer, whether he likes it or not, would have to make sure that his men on the beat behaved properly as they should, and then we would get to the position which was stated in the pub discussion at the beginning of the program: when a man gets in that van, he should be completely unharmed. That is the position we want to reach, and primarily that is a position for the police.
Is this feasible?
There are one or two points I'd like to
Yes,
make on this.
please do.
He did bring the van in, by the way, didn't he?
I was
Perhaps
hoping
should be
you
allowed
wouldn't,
to say
actually.
that it's a small van with glass panels into which people can see from the outside, and it's quite physically impossible to assault anybody in it. However,
Shall we not discuss the... No, please.
He brought it in. Just hang on a minute. I just want to say, to the barrister here, that nothing is easier to make allegations which do not have to be substantiated. He's made a great many tonight, and I would like to say that I don't think that the making of allegations in this particular irresponsible way helps this kind of discussion at all. I'd like to make 2 points very quickly in a rather different vein. I'd like to ask you to look at the program tonight, at the film tonight, against the background of the many years since the first case arose. You must see the cases, whether we agree them or whether we disagree them, against something like at least 1 million prosecutions during that period, of people of all kinds and races, all subject to argument and contention. I think it was Mr. Crawford, is it? Again, who made the point, and I wish he'd elaborated upon it, that it is claimed on behalf of the coloured community, and very rightly claimed, that the proportion of wrongdoing is no higher than it is amongst the white community, and this we readily accept. But surely if this is so, this is some evidence that the treatment of coloured people by the police can't be quite so unreasonable as our barrister friend here suggests. Surely those proportions would be rather different if that was so.
Well, no, perhaps to point out that the late Commissioner of Police, Mr. Mark, did point out in the article that you were going to read to us before that the proportion of complaints by coloured people was twice as high as that for white people. Now,
Yes,
this
indeed.
does suggest the other side of the coin.
Yes,
But
indeed.
could I make the point that needn't necessarily be because of the police entirely?
Chairman, could I make
Yes, Mr.
another
Mark.
point? I regard myself as a pretty impartial observer on this scene, and one who is deeply concerned in police complaints. And I get many complaints, many per week. And all that I would say is this, that the proportion from coloured people is rather high, extremely high. And at least I only work in a small framework for a small organisation, but it is true that there are more coloured people in my office every week complaining about the activities of the police than from any other section of the population apart from gypsies.
And could I make this point, Mr. Chairman, that the organisation which I represent has never yet made a single unsubstantiated allegation against the police. They're here in person to accept or deny the statement which I'm making.
I would like to reply to the allegation that what I am saying is irresponsible On the very contrary, what I am asking is that the police take responsibility for seeing that their own house is in order. We on this side, and we in my profession, are concerned with seeing that justice is done and is seen to be done. And in my experience, and it is an experience also which I get from talking to other members of the legal profession, that there is a lot which goes on which shouldn't go on, and I am simply asking you, Mr. Marks, and your commissioner, that you take the responsibility, and it's a very serious responsibility, for putting your house in order where it is not in order. Where it is in order, in those cases where the police do good work, that is fine, and we'll give due credit where due credit is due. But where it is not in order, then I think that you have the responsibility to put it in. And to say that I am being irresponsible when I make suggestions that things are not all in order seems to me that you want to shuffle off the problem and not face it head on. It is a serious problem. It is a problem for the whole of the society, and we've got to face it.
Gentlemen, may I just come in there? I'm not sure that we haven't covered most of this ground already. I think the mere fact that the police have agreed to appear in this program doesn't suggest any kind of complacency. I'd like to put one final question to you all before we sign off, and that is, I'd like to ask Mr. Smythe or Mr. Crawford whether you think that it does really serve any useful purpose to have this kind of program, with its tension at times, on the air in public. Mr. Smythe.
Well, I think I said before that the absence of this kind of discussion, the difficulty of getting it going, is significant, and the problems that there have been in getting this program on the air. It would only have gone on the air if we had agitated in the way that we have. We brought pressure to bear. Public opinion is on our side so that we have got this program shown. And I think it's valuable because I don't believe in sweeping problems under the carpet. And I think this is probably one of the most serious social problems of our time, which has been hidden in the background. People won't recognize it. Even the lawyers who know what's going on and see it daily in the courts won't come out. And therefore, we have to have a public exposure of this kind. And I hope that it will do some good, but it's no good if we remain merely in a state of antagonism. I hope we'll go on from here with the constructive solutions and suggestions which have been made during this program.
Thank you, Mrs. Smythe. Incidentally, you have said 2 or 3 times, and I really must deny this and rebut this absolutely. It was not the police who stopped the program going out. It was a conscious decision by the BBC on legal advice. And I think that this kind of blanket condemnation of the police is unfair and unhelpful.
Well,
I'm sorry. This I must state ex cathedra, as it were. Now may I turn to the Chief Inspector, the Deputy Commissioner, for a final word, and whether you now think, after the torments of the evening, whether this kind of program was worth putting on.
Well, first of all, may I make it clear that the objection of the police to the program was because certainly we thought it was unfair to police, but we also thought it was likely to harm good relations with the coloured community, which, whether you like to believe it or not, we are sincerely anxious to promote. It's a very difficult question to answer. If you mean, do I think it is a good thing that the police should meet representatives of the coloured community at all levels and discuss problems with them, then I give you an unequivocal yes. If you suggest to me, is this the best circumstance in which this can be done, when without wishing to criticise anybody, it is possible to make statements which cannot be checked, to make allegations which are incapable of examination, then I'm sorry, but I think that so far as this type of thing is concerned, I doubt very much whether it's a good thing. And I'm not saying that some good may not flow from it. I'm simply saying that the conditions are not necessarily ideal, but that certainly conversations should take place.
Yes.